Hello, I'm the Jersey Connoisseur, and welcome to episode 10 of the ranking of every movie that I watched in 2020. Today I'll be unveiling movies 40 to 31. Let's get into it. Beginning number 40 is The Truman Show. Now, The Truman Show is one of the most peculiar kind of films I've ever seen, in that it's so relatable to the average viewer. Particularly, what I admire is how the premise is about a guy who's been subjected to this reality his entire life, and unknowingly and without his consent, he's living this reality show, and he's not completely unaware of that. But soon he starts to realize that this world is not what it seems, and particularly when he sees someone who looks like his dad, whom he believed had perished in a tragic sailing accident when he was a kid, and it starts to make him question his entire reality. Furthermore, when he's realizes that back when he was in college, he realizes that he was in love with this girl who mysteriously disappeared, and so he's determined to find a way to find an answer to all these questions. And really makes you think about how sometimes we question our own reality that we live in, and as he strives to find a way to get out and find his way to Fiji, which is a metaphorical take on how we strive in life to find our own purpose, and he tries it in his own way too, and it's really touching in that. I think that Jim Carrey does an excellent job in his role as Truman, and while his case is tragic because there's no way of him really finding his purpose, because even if he does escape this reality, he's still going to still going to question how people are going to treat him, because people will see him as this character, not as a human being, and he's determined to be accepted as a human being, and it's really sad in that sense. And you see him throughout his interactions with his wife in the show, played by Laura Linney, and he's just so unhappy with the life he's been given, and it's so artificial in that sense. And like I said before, it makes us question our own reality, that we're all in our own Truman Show in a sense, and it's really clever in that, and it's one of the best films I watched in 2020, no doubt about that.
In case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.
Next on my list is Ratatouille, a movie that's not too dissimilar from The Truman Show, of which you have a main character who is tired of living this stagnant life of crime, basically, where he's a rat and he's part of a family, and where rats are synonymous for stealing food. But he's tired of that. He wants to become his own person. He wants to become a chef, and it's your typical like parental. Oh, you will never achieve anything like that. You should stick to the norm because it gets the job done and pays the bills. But no, Remy, voiced by Patton Oswalt, is determined to live out his dream of being a chef, and he aspires to live in France and to cook for a five-star restaurant. And through a unfortunate series of events, he does make his way to Paris and gets into this restaurant, terrified of what is happening and how he could easily become dinner for these patrons, and eventually befriends a human named Alfredo Linguini. Wait, really subtle with the name, and who's down with his luck kind of guy, who's basically the janitor and has no real role other than what we eventually uncover, that he's the son of the owner of this restaurant. And through their teamwork, they eventually are able to fulfill his Alfredo's potential, and he becomes this really very successful chef at this restaurant. But what we don't know, but what is not seen, is how Remy is pulling the strings, no pun intended, and is basically the puppet and making the food for him. And you really root for Remy in that sense, but it's tragic how because of his success, Alfredo develops an ego and soon realizes that he's better off without Remy, and the two go their separate ways. But they really cannot prosper as a team without their harmony. And eventually, when Remy becomes an integral part of the cooking staff, and while also being tracked down by Alfredo's boss, who's certain that he's up to no good. And when you see them at the end cook the final dish, the ratatouille, for the infamous food critic, and seeing his reaction is just it's just bliss, and it's so satisfying to see them succeed. And in that sense, it's one of my favorite Pixar movies. And Brad Bird knows he's so good at crafting a way of mixing kid related themes along with adult related themes, and I think this movie is a perfect example of that. Next is another Best Picture nomination from 2020, Ford vs. Ferrari, directed by James Mangold, who directed his last film, Logan, is one of my favorite films of all time. And this tells the true story of the rivalry between the Ford Motor Company and Ferrari in the 1960s as they faced off one another in the aim of sponsoring a car that would win the 24 hours of Le Mans in France. And Ford is, synonymous as being the first innovators of cars. They have really only been known for their whole commercialization of cars, and the whole how Henry Ford developed the manufacturing and how it worked to dividends for them. But they've never really been known for race cars, and Ferrari was synonymous for being some of the top for manufacturing some of the top race cars in the world. And to challenge Ferrari was be to almost a death sentence to any company. But Ford was determined to rival against Ferrari, and specifically hired a down in his luck race car driver, played by Christian Bale, teamed him up with an engineer, played by Matt Damon, to build a race car that was able to successfully challenge Ferrari at its own game. And through trials and tribulations, they were able to do that. And they faced some difficulty along the way, but they eventually find a way to defeat Ferrari at its own game. And at the same time in the story, you have a theme of family going on, with whether it be Christian Bale's family, his character's family, and particularly his relationship with his son, who's trying to keep in contact with on the side. And Matt Damon's character is not so much committed to his family as Christian Bale's, but he's still trying to create that kind of dynamic and ensure that this is a success, because the whole company is basically investing all their money into this race after the likes of the failed Edsel and AL and Ford, and they eventually do endure success, but not without some tragedy, as Christian Bale's character dies, and that really is a humbling moment in this movie. And overall, it's such a well-crafted film. The sound mixing in this movie is unlike any other movie, and it's so riveting in the action in the race. Next up is Back to the Future, movie that, like with last week when I showed Ferris Bueller's Day Off, came out in the mid 1980s, 1985 to be exact, and is really not aged at all. And it tells us the story of, I think everyone knows the story of Marty McFly, a teenager down in his luck, who befriends a scientist, Doc Brown, and hijinks ensue, and how he's transported to 1955, and he learns of a greater appreciation of his parents, and eventually has to in a way to make sure his parents meet again, and make sure that their fate is sealed. And there's a lot of comedic moments in this movie that are just unlike any movie that that has existed to that point. It was truly revolutionary in that sense, and it's so thrilling in that it's almost a flawless movie in that sense. And I don't know how or if they should ever remake this movie. And the dynamic between Doc Brown and Marty McFly is unlike any other, and they're so famous for that dynamic. And there are a couple awkward scenes in this movie, particularly where he's he almost gets in a romantic relationship with his mom, his future mother, and that's kind of weird, but it's very wholesome in that, and there's no, and it knows what it's going for, and it's not trying to be too serious, and even, I mean, heck, they even have the time machine being a DeLorean car, and it's just very clever in its own right. And overall, it's just such a well crafted film that is a classic today. Next up is Fantastic Mr. Fox, one of the shortest movies I watched this year, but also directed by my favorite director, Wes Anderson. This is based off the Roald Dahl short story, and what I really like about this movie is the animation. Like the stop motion animation is really what makes this movie memorable in its own right. The the characters are also very likable, and it moves, it flows well, which is good to see. And it's just such a lot of subtle comedic moments to this where, and honestly, I think you know it utilizes the animals very well to their all their traits. Where you have particularly Mr. Fox, Fantastic Mr. Fox, is portrayed as is sly, and he's kind of mischievous in his own ways, and he's trying to find a way to care for his family, and so much so that he's willing to go break into this factory and retrieve what he rightfully believes to be his, and he's trying to fight for what he believes in, while these farmers are trying to get back this item that they really want, and at the same time, their home is being destroyed because of the humans, and this is one of the movies where you don't sympathize with the humans at all. You want them, you want the animals to you want to see the animals succeed, and seeing them having to go underground for their own safety is terrifying, and it actually makes you have a greater appreciation of animals in general after seeing this movie, because you realize how they have, even though this movie is a fictionalized version, that every living being has a soul, and they should be treated as one and respected for that. Speaking of soul, as we are officially halfway through this list today, it is Coco. This movie follows the story of a young boy in Mexico who is determined to become a musician. However, his family is completely against musicians because of the notion of one of their family members went on to become a famous musician and never amounted to anything, and as a result, he died. And so we're rooting for this kid, but at the same time, we know that it's not right. He's not supposed to be doing this. And he's only to do some pretty insane things to get to to get into this profession, not including stealing a guitar that was sacred to his family and his great grandfather. And we're led to believe that his great grandfather was this famous musician named Ernesto de la Cruz. And you see on the side the side character who's kind of a bumbly and kind of gacky guy. And once Miguel is transported into the Day of the Dead world, or the world of the deceased, who are portrayed as skeletons, and he befriends this guy who he is unknowingly related to, and it's charming in that sense as they develop a relationship, and while they may not agree and on certain things, and eventually betrays him, but eventually at the end of the day, they are family. And despite the fact that he betrayed, that his great grandfather betrayed his family, he was only doing it in for his family. And seeing him die, pass away at the hands of Ernesto de la Cruz, I mean, his his reveal as a villain was totally caught me off guard, and for that I have to applaud them. In that sense, it's such a heartwarming film, and the music in this film is like on no other from a Pixar film, and the message behind it is unique in that family always comes first, and you should never judge a book by its cover. Next up is another Pixar movie that came out in 2019, Toy Story 4. Now, when this was announced, I was a little hesitant because of I felt like Toy Story 3 left on a good note. But I think that this was a interesting twist on in addition to the canon of the Toy Story franchise, where we now know Andy is grown up and is no longer in property owner of these toys, and now Woody and company and Buzz Lightyear are left to the care of Bonnie, this little girl. And as this movie takes place right after Toy Story 3, we see her learn to usually do normal kid things, which is play with their toys. And as a kid, you don't know any better, and any object you see can be seen as a toy. And she eventually creates this concoction of a spork and other materials, and eventually goes to come to life, and it faces like an almost existential crisis because it doesn't really know what it is, and as a result, it attempts to kill itself. But no, Woody eventually tells this toy that its purpose is to be played with by Bonnie, and eventually it grows to accept its purpose and eventually and help out as they attempt to uncover what's happening at this toy store, and where Bo Peep has been living for the past 20 years. And I felt like that part of the story was a little a little far-fetched and unnecessary to the whole, like, and I appreciate the deep thoughts into the existential world. But again, at the same time, at the end of the day, this is a movie about toys, and I feel like they're kind of milking at this point. I still think this is a good movie in terms of Pixar, but a disappointment in terms of Toy Story lore, and but at the same time, there are I think that the themes of existentialism really propel this movie to the top half of my list. Next is American Made, directed by Doug Liman, who did Edge of Tomorrow and Mr. and Mrs. Smith. This movie follows the insane true story of a airline pilot in the late 1970s who would wound up becoming the personal smuggler, basically, for for the Colombian drug cartel and the likes of Pablo Escobar. And we're introduced to this character played by Tom Cruise as this ideal guy, and he's living the American dream. He's a successful pilot on an airline, and it seems like everything's well. But he's gone to the point where nothing's really changed in his occupation, and he's growing complacent, and as a result, he decides to move on. And he wants some excitement in his life, and I don't blame him. But sometimes that excitement can lead to doing some shady things, and he finds himself in a situation where he's confronted by this CIA agent played by Domhnall Gleeson to help out in transporting all these drugs from Central America to the United States. And this is really part of a larger plan to battle against the war the war on drugs, and particularly help ousting the communist regimes in Central America, particularly in the likes of Nicaragua and Panama. And obviously it's based on a true story. And eventually, after his consistent smuggling of drugs and successful smuggling of drugs to the United States, eventually is now bringing people over to help train them and bring them back to fight against. And it's really sickening how they were doing this, because obviously was not working at all. And as he gets more successful, as he gets more money, and he moves to this small Kentucky town, which is basically a hotspot for the smuggling and the training of all these soldiers that eventually just really want to come to the United States to flee the situation and their horrendous situation in Central America. We realize it's for a bigger cause, and while we originally see Barry Seal as a sympathetic character, he eventually becomes a tragic character, because we know he's a good guy. He feels like he's doing the right thing, but he's obviously not. He's not, and eventually he is confronted and blackmailed and arrested, and subsequently he ended up getting murdered by the Colombian drug cartel for not complying with with their demands. And it's tragic seeing that. And boy, did a lot of crazy things happen in the 1980s, 1970s, and 1980s. I can't even imagine. And this is an insane story that I think is an underrated film. Next on my list is Die Hard, the prototypical Christmas movie. And yes, I'm calling it a Christmas movie about a New York City cop that flies out to Los Angeles for a Christmas party for his ex-wife, is eventually and unknowingly has to endure this basically living hell and fight off these terrorists who have taken control of the building and are planning to blow it up. And this is just a straight 2.5 hour Red Bull energy drink. Like, there's so much going on. There's so much foreshadowing that comes to help in the end, particularly in the opening scene where he's on the airplane, and the person he's sitting next to mentions to him about how to walk on glass with bare feet, and eventually comes in handy when that happens in the tower, and how the juxtapose John McClane and Hans Gruber. As John McClane is this hero, and he thinks he's doing right. He's doing the right thing by saving all these people. And the same thing is the case in Hans Gruber's mind. He believes that he's liberating these people, and that they have a pointless life, and they work for this company every day and night and don't really achieve anything. He's attempting to liberate them, and he's completely has flawed ideals, but he's doing what he believes is right, and eventually gets comeuppance and he dies. And it's satisfying in that sense. And you obviously root for John McClane. Obviously, the famous quote
Happy trails, Hans.
is, and seeing him take it's almost comical in how overpowered he is, and yet he only has a couple weapons here and there, but he uses his skills as a New York City police officer to full extent, and eventually succeeds in defeating the terrorists and winning back the affection of his wife, even though he knows that as much as he tries to do this for his wife, he'll never get back to the same kind of relationship that they had before this. And last but not least for today is Avengers Endgame, a movie that I was grateful of witnessing firsthand in the movie theater in 2019. And that was an experience that I will never forget for the rest of my life. It's such an incredible film. And obviously the premise is that after the events of Avengers Infinity War, where the universe was decimated and completely eradicated. The remaining Avengers attempt to survive and find a way to make up for this event and change their fate, change their destiny. And it's not a very thought-provoking film, but it does have themes of dealing with depression and how, and I think that you look at specifically the character of Thor, who has gone through so much in his life. The death of his brother, the death of his parents, death of half his kingdom in Asgard, and his transformation. I think is realistic. I think he does go through the 5 stages of grief. And while I actually wish they didn't use his grief as much of a comedic part as they do, I think it's realistic in how he would go into that kind of depression. And as well, not even to mention how compared with how Bruce Banner deals with the defeat and how decimated he is, and how he's now determined to unite the two conflicting parts of his personality, Bruce Banner and the Hulk, and eventually he turns into Smart Hulk. And while he doesn't play in a while he doesn't physically play an immense part of this movie, his role in bringing everyone back is really great to see. And how can I forget about the role of Iron Man in this movie, and his tragedy too, and how he is witnesses firsthand the defeat to Thanos, comes back to Earth completely disarray, and seeing that scene, the opening where he's almost lifeless, is devastating because you've seen his highs, and to see him in this the rock bottom for all the Avengers at the start of that movie, and eventually they're able to make their way up, bring the team back together, and you're seeing them even bring back Hawkeye, and then in the end, the final scene at the Avengers compound will go down in movie history as iconic. And particularly when Captain America, when he inherits Mjolnir, the hammer, it's like unlike any other scene I've ever seen in a movie. I was almost fangirling there. Like, what a series of events! It's just such a satisfying conclusion to the trilogy, to the whole series of 22 movies, and I can't think of any other way that they could have done this movie. And I left that movie theater, and I left this past time this last year extremely satisfied, and it felt like it lived up to my expectations. So anywho, that's my list for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more. And join me next time as I unveil movies 30 to 21. Arrivederci.